Hello and welcome to the Extras. I'm Tim Millard, your host, and joining me today is noir historian and host of TCM's Noir Alley, Eddie Muller. Hi, Eddie.
Hi, Tim. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, it's been a little bit. You have a book coming out. I mean, it's a new book because it's been revised quite a bit. Well, why don't you tell us about this book? Dark City Dames, the Women Who Defined Film Noir, fully revised and updated.
Well, it's interesting. You say it is a reissue, but what's interesting is it has a slightly different title than when it was first issued back in the early. I think it came out in 2001 is my recollection, and it was called Dark City Dames: The Wicked Women of Film Noir. That was the one subtle change the publisher requested, was that we change from just Wicked Women of Film Noir to the Women Who Defined Film Noir, which I was perfectly fine with because they were doing such a gorgeous job, revamping and sort of remodeling the book and adding 10 additional profiles to the 6 that comprise the original edition of the book. And it's a book that I've been eager to get back in print for years. And in many ways, Tim, I'm glad that it didn't happen right away because my relationship with Running Press as a publisher has just been so wonderful. They've done such a good job. They let me do a revised and expanded version of Dark City, my first film noir book, and then did the cocktail book with me and the children's book, noir book with me. And it's just a really, really good relationship. And so I'm glad that I waited and got the treatment that I really wanted. So the gist of the book is that, and it really does go hand in hand with the Noir City Festival in Hollywood. The book goes hand in hand with that festival, which is where I started doing film noir festivals 26 years ago. We just finished the 26th edition. And in that first year that we did the festival, all of the women that I profile in this book were still living and came as guests to the festival.
Oh, wow.
And because of that, I pitched an idea to Los Angeles Magazine, about interviewing and profiling these women. But that was just a short little thing to promote the festival. But when they all agreed and I met them and spoke with them and then interviewed them at the venue, just the idea of the book occurred to me because I would sit in the audience with them watching the film, and it was so fascinating to see these women who were all at least in their 70s, in their mid to late 70s at that point, some slightly older, to see them watching their younger selves up on the screen with a whole new generation of viewers that they never expected would be there. Was so intriguing to me. Like, what was that journey like for them to go from being 25 years old and, gorgeous and a hot property in Hollywood and all that, to being these women who hadn't acted in, in some cases hadn't acted in 30, 40 years. I was just really intrigued by that. And I was so grateful that they were so generous to open up and talk about their lives. And that's the bedrock of the book is their stories.
Yeah, because you have it kind of the first part and the second part. We're talking about the original book. You always had that first part, which was a telling of their story as a younger person in the height of their fame, maybe. And then the part 2 was you went back and you talked to them now in their 70s and 80s.
Correct. So it was, and I'm so grateful to the original publisher of the book. It was done by HarperCollins, and Judith Regan was the publisher. And Judith, that was an unusual idea to say, I want the book to be as much about these women when they were older and no longer in Hollywood as it was about their early days and how exciting and thrilling it was to, be a movie star. And Judith, to her credit, said, that's a really good idea. Nobody's really done that. I mean, they've done it as a biography of a famous actress. If you're Lauren Bacall or Lana Turner or somebody like that, they got the full treatment.
Mhm.
This is the breadth of their life. But these were all actresses who weren't household names. They were synonymous with film noir,
Right.
but they were not, the average moviegoer doesn't know Marie Windsor or Audrey Totter or Anne Savage. So that was different because I wanted to write about working actresses who never quite made the big time.
Mhm.
I know Evelyn Keyes is turning in her grave right now, saying, "What do you mean I didn't make the big time? I was a big star."
Yeah.
Um, but that was what I really wanted it to be about. It's sort of like, in a sense, like in the Coen Brothers did Inside Llewyn Davis, right? And it's like the guy who was good, but he didn't make it.
Right. Right.
He wasn't Bob Dylan.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And so now you have the Bob Dylan biopic, which will make a great double bill with the Coen Brothers movie at some point. But that was sort of like my inspiration for the book, was like, what's it like to almost grab the brass ring, but not quite, and then have to carve out a normal life for yourself after that.
Right. And of course, many books have been written about femme fatales, to glorifying that kind of concept. And in that sense, your book is so different because there's a real stamp of realism, because you're talking to them now when they're older, and there's a perspective and they can look back. I thought it was unique, just such a unique hook and so enjoyable, because I didn't read through all of the book yet, but I didn't even read through the full first section. I just took Jane Greer. I read her first part, and then I read her second part. I didn't
Right.
jump to the next actress in the order there, because I actually wanted to get that two-sided mirror kind of perspective right away. And I thought that was fun. I mean, a reader can choose however they want to read the book. You've broken up very easily for that. But I think that as a noir fan, but somebody who kind of came to it a little bit later in my life, and I think a lot of people have done that. Didn't grow up a fan of noir. As you age, sometimes that that becomes more and more something that for myself, I was attracted to those films. And so I don't know all the stories. And I don't know the stories of them even younger, unless I've seen, the biographies on A&E, or I've read some of the biographies, as you mentioned. So I thought it was a great way to do it. And that part of the second part of the story, I wanted to ask you specifically, what was some of the joy and interest and things you found out in doing that?
That's a great question, because, and I appreciate your saying that you can read the book any which way. I've read it both ways.
Yeah. Sure.
But the real joy I got out of it is that I learned so much from these women. And to me, it was more interesting talking to them about how they orchestrated their lives post Hollywood than in Hollywood, because the part in Hollywood was pretty simple in that era, right? If you were chosen, if they touched you with the magic wand, you were pretty much taken care of, right? And I lucked out in doing this book, because this was not a contrived thing. I didn't cast the book necessarily, right? I mean, the deal was the women had to still be alive and willing to talk to me, right? But the good news was, like, Colleen Gray was under contract to Fox, and Audrey Totter was under contract to MGM, right? And Evelyn was at Columbia. And so I just naturally got through their stories. I got pictures of these different studios and how they varied from each other. And the players were all different. Like Jane was at RKO and obviously had that really tumultuous situation with Howard Hughes there. And then, Colleen let me introduce people to Daryl Zanuck and Tyrone Power and the people who were at Fox. So all that was really great, but it was the later stuff that really intrigued me. You know, that's where like Ann Savage, her story in Hollywood, and Ann was the star of, you know, arguably one of the most famous noir films of all time, Detour. But you know, it's a B- production, and it kind of backfired on Anne, because while she's legendary for the film, it cast her in a mold that she couldn't break. And a lot of A-list directors passed on her because they saw her in Detour, and she scared them. And it was like, I don't think I want to work with that woman, right? so that it was a bad thing for her career. And then her life afterwards was just an amazing story, you know, of fortitude. And it was really one of the things that really came to the fore for me was how, you know, that generation, the women, especially women like this, who are so beautiful and they're movie stars, and it's like, you know, they're the prize.
Yeah.
And so they marry these guys who treat them like, you know, put them on a pedestal and treat them so special. And they're never privy to what the husband is actually doing. Right. And this is a very common story. So there are a couple of instances where it comes as a big shock when it's like, we're bankrupt, you know?
Yeah.
And like, how did that happen? And then how do you know, because that was Anne's story, right? I mean, she just went along for the ride, and her husband said, I'll take care of everything. And then little by little, it became apparent that, you know, they were hemorrhaging money. And when he died, Anne was broke. You know, she had to go back to work. And at that point, she was in her 50s. And it's like, she's not going back to work as an actress. So, you know, she ends up working as a docket clerk in a law firm in Los Angeles. But then Detour is still there, you know, lurking in the background, waiting for its revival as this example of noir. And then it's great because the younger Anne comes back in Anne's life to like rescue her and give her this third act where she's recognized for this incredible performance. So it was that kind of arc to the stories that really, really intrigued me.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and everybody has maybe their favorite films and their favorite actresses, but all of the stories are so insightful, and I just thought they were great. Was there anybody that you said the prominent? They obviously had to be alive and willing to do an interview. Was there anybody that wasn't willing or wasn't alive that you just were like, you know, just slight disappointment on that one?
Yes, there were right off the bat. There were 3 additional actresses I was hoping to profile, and to me, it was very interesting that this is not uncommon. I don't think I wanted to interview Elizabeth Scott. I wanted to interview Claire Trevor and Rhonda Fleming, and the 3 of them all escaped for interesting and different reasons. Claire was just not up to it physically. She had terrible emphysema, and I did talk to her several times to interview her on the phone, but not in the depth that was necessary to do a profile of her. She's in the new edition because I didn't really get to interview her in depth, but I do profile her and her contributions to noir. And Claire was very, very wealthy, very wealthy. And Rhonda Fleming didn't want to do the book because this is a funny story. I'll tell this real quick.
Sure.
I remember setting up a conversation to discuss the book with her, and she asked me straight away, Eddie, how many times have I been married? And I said 4. And she said, nope, that's the wrong answer. I've been married twice, you know. And she said, I was married to Ted Mann, and I'm married to Daryl, my husband now. And I said, well, Rhonda, it's like public record that you've been married that many times, and I can't pretend that you weren't. I mean, nobody's going to believe anything else we say then. And she says, well, then I'm not going to do the book. And the reason for that is because she was amazing philanthropist, and because of her marriage to Ted Mann, she too was extremely wealthy, and she didn't want to jeopardize any of her reputation as a philanthropist or anything. She didn't want me to. Not that there was anything in Rhonda's background to be embarrassed about or anything. She just didn't want to do it, and we became really good friends anyway. And she appeared many times and donated money to restore one of her films that I, was responsible for restoring. But then Liz Scott was just a recluse. She has skeletons in the closet that she didn't want to mess around with. So she just said no. But it was interesting to me that the two women who were the most affluent, Claire Trevor and Rhonda Fleming, didn't want to talk. Whereas actresses like Anne, who really had to scrape by, were more than happy to discuss their life story. That was kind of intriguing.
Have you gotten some responses that stick in your mind from readers from the first issuing of the book?
Yes, the most important feedback was from them, from the actresses themselves, because I told them going in that I wasn't going to show them anything. Right, that was a requisite,
right,
for cooperating with me. As I said, look, I have to do this the way I want to do this, and because there's 6 of you, if I say to one of you, yes, you can review the copy before I submit it to the publisher, then I am obligated to do that for all 6. And I say, this is just going to slow everything down. I'm going to be answering to 7 editors then.
Yeah, right.
And so I said, I'm not going to show you anything. You just have to trust me and accept that you'll be okay with the story that comes out of it. And I'm telling you, Tim, the thing that I find most gratifying, not just about this book, but perhaps about in my entire career, is that they all were very pleased with the way the book turned out and their sections in the book turned out. And they felt like it was a very accurate and true depiction of their life story. And to the degree that I was so pleased that Jane Greer's sons, who were very surprised that she told me the things that she did, but it didn't bother anyone,
No, but they're very personal family. There's some very personal family stuff there, especially.
Oh yes. When there's a little, Jane had a life-threatening medical issue that was pretty traumatic that she did not really like to talk about, because it left her literally scarred, like horribly, horribly scarred. And she didn't want people to know that. She didn't want people to know that, gorgeous Jane Greer, had this just miserable situation occur. And then, her husband left her.
Yeah.
And it was traumatizing for her boys who were away at school. And no, that story had never been told. Right. And so they were kind of shocked. But in the end, when Jane passed away, I'm sorry to say, but her sons, Albert and Stephen, said, we'd like to give away copies of the book at her memorial service, just because we can't think of a better thing to send people away with. Like, this was Jane. Right?
Wow.
So that means everything to me.
Yeah. Now, when you revised this book, were parts of that first release revised as well, or were just more new photos and that kind of parts?
There was nothing in the text of the 6 original profiles that was changed.
That's pretty amazing.
Nothing.
Yeah.
I added the afterword.
Okay.
To explain, because I'm not in the book. I'm not a character in the book. which is a little tricky to kind of have this omniscient, like I'm
But
in
it
Evelyn's
reads,
apartment.
because of that, it reads, it's not just like, hey, you're reading a bunch of interviews. You tell it as a story. We talked about Norbar, last year or so. But, I had my little drink with me as I'm reading these because it was riveting, because
Oh,
it is written more as a story and less as a interview where somebody, so Jane, what did you think?
correct,
Instead, you
correct.
wove, you
And
wove,
and
and
and that
you jumped time periods, and you added in the characters in the second phase of their lives, their husbands or partners and their children, and I thought that made it, so much more of a good read.
thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I want to give the credit for that to the women,
Yeah.
because I was able to do that because they granted me so much time and access to I don't want to say live with them, but it kind of felt like that.
Right.
I spent a lot of time at their houses. I spent a lot of time. I would say, look, if I'm in town, because I didn't live in LA, right? So I mean, it was like I had to do this when I could, and I said, I'd like to go with you, when you're doing stuff. Just take me along, and I won't be a bother or anything, but I just want to see your life at this point, and experience it. So like I spent a lot of time in Evelyn's apartment and in Anne's apartment and Colleen's house, up at Jane's house above the Getty, and so I was able to describe them in their environment without doing it the way you see in interviews, where it's like we sat facing each
Yeah.
other over steamy cups of coffee and blah blah blah.
Right.
No, it was just like I could describe Jane's day and take myself out of it completely.
Right.
And I felt that was really, really
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things you did revise maybe were some of the photos that
Yes.
were added, because that's, it's number one, it's a huge book. And so it works well when you have these full page black and white color
Yes. Yes.
reproductions of the photos. And I mean, the glamour shots, they're beautiful in here. And then of course, some of the other publicity stills and things. So that part, were more added or.
Yes, and it's funny you mentioned that, Tim, because that was one of the things I was most worried about in doing this new edition, was that for the original one, this is deep in the weeds stuff here, but I'm going to share this with you.
Sure.
For the original one, the gals, as I referred to them, the gals gave me a lot of personal photographs to use, right? And these were, which are great, Polaroids and candid shots and stuff. They'd let me wander around the house, and I'd say, "Oh, can I get it? Can I get this?" And they were very generous. But I had to give all that back, right? And I scanned it all.
Yeah.
But that was 24 years ago, right? Good luck
Right.
accessing those scans with all the changes in technology. And I couldn't even find some of the, what do they call it? They had the discs, that you would put in, and like none of that stuff works on the new computers, right? So I was pulling my hair out. And then finally I said, hey, they've had so many advances in the Photoshop technology and stuff. I said, I bet I can cheat and just scan the pictures out of the book and then enhance them to make them good enough to use in the new edition. And we cheated a few times with that. Yes.
Well, I wouldn't know by looking at them because they turned out so well. But we talk about this whenever we talk about even film restoration. The equipment and the software these days is amazing. And it just is next level in terms of what you're able to do with even your own family photos.
Yes,
when
exactly.
you go and you try to.
I would never go so far as to cheat and do an AI, which you can do now. You just say, show me a picture of Marie Windsor with so and so, in 1953.
Just adding the contrast back in and trying to take out some of the dust or some of the scratches and things of that nature. The equipment that software that can do that is so good now. So, like you said, that's a little bit in the weeds, but tell us a little bit about the newer section that you added to this book called Eternal Flames.
Well, this was, speaking very frankly, if Running Press was going to pay me for a new edition of the book, they wanted some work out of me.
Sure.
So it was like, we're not just going to reprint the original 6. How about writing us, 10 new profiles, which quite honestly, I initially resisted because I said, they're not going to be anything like the 6 original ones when I had all this access. But then I thought about it and I realized, well, this is a great opportunity because I can choose actresses to sort of balance the stories out, because the one common denominator my 6 gals had was that they lived to ripe old ages, right? And so I said, well, it'd be an interesting contrast to profile some actresses who didn't, right? Who were the classic stories of how Hollywood ate them up and spit them out, right? And so, I don't want to spoil it because some people reading the book might not know the fates of some of the additional actresses that I profile. And I imagine for younger readers, that section, some of it will come as a shock, because there's some pretty, profoundly tragic endings for a couple of these women. But I thought that was really that those stories enhance the tales of the women who survived, right? So it's like if somebody read Anne's story and said, "Oh, that's so sad that she lost everything and had to go back to work and blah blah blah," my answer would be, "Yeah, but she's not Gail Russell, right? Because Gail Russell had just a tragic end." And so you can say something sad, but then there's
Sure.
no, compared to this story, she had a perfectly wonderful life.
Well, how'd you go about choosing those 10?
Partly it was, in the case of Claire Trevor, Rhonda Fleming, and Marcia Hunt, and Jan Sterling, those are 4 of them. I ended up knowing them all as well. Okay. So it was like, yeah, I feel very comfortable writing about them and what kind of people they were because I knew them. I didn't really know Claire, but I knew enough, and I wanted to give Claire her due as being, a very important performer in film noir that is often overlooked, right? Claire Trevor was like between the status of Stanwyck and Joan Crawford and Ida Lupino, and but she was a bigger star than Colleen Gray or Audrey Totter, actresses who are totally synonymous with noir. And the year that Stanwyck played in Double Indemnity, Claire Trevor played in Murder My Sweet, and those 2 femme fatale performances sort of set the template for that character in the genre. So I wanted to make sure that Claire got her due. And then in other cases, it was like actresses who weren't getting their due, like Peggy Castle, who had a very brief career, but a lot of it was spent playing this femme fatale character in 50s noir. And so I definitely wanted to profile her. And, Joan Bennett, who, like Claire Trevor, was another big star, who in the 40s that was virtually all she made was film noir movies, right? So I had to do a profile of Joan. And, it was like casting my own noir film in a way.
Right. What, no, did you have any surprises as you were going into these 10, the research for these 10, in terms of you thought you knew and then you found out something different?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that there were some surprises with the early lives of some of these actresses, like Ruth Roman and Helen Walker. What surprised me was how it's very interesting how people get into the business, because there are some actresses like Ruth Roman where it's like nothing is going to stop her. So, she made up her mind when she was a child that she was going to be an actress. She changed her name because she saw it on a theater marquee when she was like 6 years old or something. and like her story is like this, the myth of Sisyphus. She just kept pushing the rock up the hill until she made it. Right. And And then there are other actresses like Jan Sterling, where it was just a virtual coincidence that she ducked into a building in New York to get out of the rain and was spotted by a producer and said, I want to put you in this show. And then her career was like off to the races. I mean, she wanted to be an actress, but it just came so easily to her. And so those stories are always kind of fascinating to me, like the moment, right? I mean, we love noir movies because there's always that moment, the turning point moment where they know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, and in the lives of these actresses, there was always that moment where it's like, oh, I wish this would happen. And then here it is. Here's the chance,
For those of you interested in learning more about the books and films we discussed today, there are links in the podcast show notes and on our website at www.theextras.tv. If this is the first episode of The Extras you've listened to and you enjoyed it, please think about following the show at your favorite podcast provider. And if you're on social media, be sure and follow the show on Facebook or Twitter at The Extras TV or Instagram at theextras.tv to stay up to date on our upcoming guests and to be part of our community. Until next time, you've been listening to Tim Millard. Stay slightly obsessed.